March 10, 1988. A modest house in Oxfordshire, England, where the silence feels heavier than any applause Andy Gibb had ever received. No disco balls casting rainbow fragments across the walls, no screaming fans waiting outside, no camera crews documenting the final moments of pop royalty. Here, in this deliberate absence of spotlights, Andrew Roy Gibb, the youngest brother of the Bee Gees, the golden boy who had conquered American radio, the heartthrob who had seemed invincible, draws his final breath at just 30 years old. The death certificate will read myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. The human truth cuts deeper. Andy Gibb died of a heart. Andrew died of expectation. The Bee Gees sang in falsetto. Andy's truth was sung in a lower, lonelier key. Andy Gibb, the name that once dominated billboard charts, television screens, and teenage dreams across America. The youngest member of pop music's royal family who proved that talent could skip no generations, but also that the industry's machinery could grind down even the most gifted hearts. The brother who stood forever in the shadow of Barry, Robin, and Morris, close enough to taste their success, never quite close enough to share their harmony. As paramedics arrive at the house where Andy had been staying, their sirens breaking the rural quiet that had become his refuge, the music industry that had elevated him to unprecedented heights remains largely unaware that their golden prince has fallen. No breaking news alerts interrupt regular programming. No record executives scramble to manage the aftermath. The young man who had trained millions of hearts to beat in time with his melodies had finally found the silence he had been unconsciously seeking. The phone calls that follow are surprisingly few. In 1977, every call to Andy Gibb was answered by eager assistants. In 1988, the phone barely rings at all. But perhaps this quiet ending was what he had unconsciously chosen. The stage lights made him. The shadows kept him human. And in choosing countryside over celebrity, solitude over spectacle, he had finally escaped the golden cage that had been both his blessing and his curse. To understand how the most beloved young star in America learned to disappear into darkness, we must journey back to the beginning, to a boy named Andrew Roy Gibb who learned that love in his family was paid for in perfect harmony. Born March 5th, 1958 on the Isle of Man to Barbara and Hugh Gibb, Andrew Roy Gibb entered a family where music wasn't just the business, it was the language of love, the currency of approval, the air they breathed. His older brothers, Barry, Robin, and Maurice, had already begun their journey toward becoming the Bee Gees, their voices blending into the harmonies that would define a generation. Young Andy could feel the gravitational pull of their success from his earliest memories. The Gibb household operated like a conservatory where emotions were expressed through melodies and relationships negotiated through songs. Andy's first memories were of his brothers hunched over guitars and notebooks, of the electric anticipation that preceded each new composition, of the way approval was measured in perfect pitch and flawless timing. But where his brothers moved through their musical development as a unified entity, three voices creating something larger than the sum of their parts, Andy existed as a satellite, close enough to the action to feel its heat, distant enough to wonder if he truly belonged. The age gap between him and his siblings created a natural separation that would define his entire life. Always the little brother, always catching up, always proving himself worthy of the family name. Even as a child, Andy possessed something his brothers didn't, an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences on a purely emotional level, while Barry, Robin, and Maurice crafted intricate harmonies and complex arrangements. Andy's gift was both simpler and more dangerous. He could make people fall in love with him just by being himself. Teachers would remember how Andy could command a room without trying, how his natural charisma drew both peers and adults into his orbit. But they also recalled a melancholy that seemed unusual in someone so young, a tendency to withdraw when the attention became too intense, as if he instinctively understood that his gift could become his burden. The family's move to Australia marked the beginning of Andy's musical education in earnest. Surrounded by his brother's increasing success, he began to understand both the intoxicating power of performance and its hidden costs. He watched them navigate the pressures of fame, the demands of constant creativity, the way success could isolate you even as it surrounded you with admirers. From the beginning, Andy learned that to be loved in this family meant finding your place in the harmony. But harmony, he would discover, required sacrificing parts of yourself that sang in different keys. Melody versus harmony. The simple, powerful songs he heard in his head versus the complex musical architecture his brothers created together. By his teenage years, Andy had begun to carve out his own musical identity, but the path was fraught with the weight of expectation and comparison. His voice carried a sweetness that his brothers didn't possess, a vulnerability that could break hearts across radio waves. But it also carried the burden of constant measurement against his family's achievements. His first professional recording experiences in Australia revealed both his potential and his fragility. Where his brothers approached music as craftsmen, Andy approached it as a lover, pouring his entire emotional being into every note, every phrase, every moment of connection with his audience. It was an approach that would make him famous, but it would also leave him defenseless against the industry's casual cruelties. The move to America in the mid-1970s was presented as an opportunity, but it was also an exile. Andy would build his career not alongside his brothers, but in parallel to them. Close enough to benefit from their success, but distant enough to forge his own path. It was a lonely position that would define the rest of his life, always the fourth Bee Gee who was never quite a Bee Gee at all. The American music industry of the late 1970s was a machine designed to manufacture teen idols quickly and efficiently. Andy found himself caught in its gears before he fully understood what was happening to him. The photo shoots were relentless, the interview schedule punishing, the touring demands constant. He learned to compartmentalize, to become the smiling, confident performer that audiences expected while keeping his true self safely locked away. But even as he mastered the performance of being Andy Gibb, something essential was being lost in translation. The spontaneous, sensitive young man who had first picked up a guitar was being gradually replaced by a carefully constructed product designed to fulfill teenage fantasies. Stage versus shadow. The brilliant performer under spotlights versus the uncertain young man who lived in darkness between shows. The breakthrough came in 1977 with I Just Want to Be Your Everything, a song that seemed to capture perfectly the disco era's optimistic hedonism while revealing Andy's deeper emotional needs. The single shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making him an instant sensation and proving that the Gibb family's gifts extended beyond the trio that had made them famous. But success in America came with a price that Andy was unprepared to pay. The transformation from promising young artist to teen idol phenomenon happened with dizzying speed, leaving him little time to adjust to the enormous pressures that accompanied his newfound fame. The external trappings of success accumulated rapidly. Magazine covers, television appearances, sold-out concerts, screaming fans who treated him like a fantasy made flesh. But those who worked closely with him began to notice troubling signs. Between performances, he would disappear into himself, sitting quietly in dressing rooms with an expression that seemed far too old for his face. Flowing Rivers, his debut album, established him as more than just a one-hit wonder. Songs like Love is Thicker Than Water showcased a maturing artist who could balance commercial appeal with genuine emotional depth. But they also revealed someone struggling to understand his own feelings, using his music as a form of therapy for wounds he couldn't fully articulate. The comparison to his brothers was constant, and unavoidable. Critics praised his individual achievements while always noting that he was Barry's little brother, or referencing his famous family. The connection that had opened doors for him also created a ceiling he could never break through. He learned to sell tenderness. No one taught him to keep any for himself. By 1978, Andy Gibb had achieved something unprecedented. Shadow Dancing, his second album, spawned 3 consecutive #1 hits, making him the first artist since the Beatles to achieve such a feat. His face graced magazine covers from Teen Beat to Rolling Stone. His concerts sold out within hours. His name was mentioned alongside Elvis and Michael Jackson as the defining heartthrobs of his generation. But success brought isolation that fame couldn't fill. Andy began to understand the cruel mathematics of celebrity. The more people who loved his image, the fewer who knew his reality. 2 mirrors told the story of his transformation. In the studio mirror, surrounded by stylists and image consultants who managed every aspect of his appearance, he saw Andy Gibb, the teen idol, a carefully constructed fantasy designed to fulfill teenage dreams. In the bathroom mirror at home, alone with his thoughts and his fears, he saw Andrew, a young man drowning in expectations he had never asked to meet. In the studio mirror, Andy Gibb watched strangers arrange his reflection into a product. Collar higher, smile softer, mystery on cue. In the bathroom mirror, Andrew watched his face forget the words. The first glass told him he was everything. The second asked why that never felt like enough. The first paid in platinum. The second charged interest in silence. Between them, a boy learned to lip-sync to his own life. Fame handed him a costume and called it intimacy. Music still came, but now as anesthesia. He could sell every note except the one he needed most: mercy. And mercy, he learned too late, is a song you must sing to yourself first. His relationship with Victoria Principal became both salvation and curse. The actress represented everything Andy thought he wanted: beauty, sophistication, someone who understood fame's pressures. But their high-profile romance also became a media circus that robbed both of them of any possibility of genuine privacy. "I wasn't prepared for fame. It swallowed me whole," he confessed to a journalist during this period, in one of the few moments when his guard was completely down. Fame versus love. The constant scrutiny that made authentic relationship nearly impossible versus the desperate need for genuine human connection. The disco era was reaching its peak, and Andy was positioned as one of its crown princes. But disco's relentless optimism felt increasingly artificial to someone grappling with depression and isolation. The music that had made him famous began to feel like a prison, each performance a reminder of the gap between his public image and his private reality. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The evidence suggests that even at his peak, Andy was already planning various forms of escape. He talked about different kinds of music, about disappearing from the public eye, about finding a way back to the simplicity he had lost. Famous for being loved, destroyed by having to be lovable. The beginning of the end came not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow dissolution that few people noticed until it was too late. The year was 1979, and Andy was still achieving commercial success when the first serious cracks appeared in his perfect facade. After Dark, his third album, while commercially successful, revealed an artist struggling with his own image and his own increasingly fragmented sense of self. The recording sessions became troubled. Andy would arrive hours late, if at all. When he did appear, he seemed distracted, unable to focus on the music that had once been his refuge. The joy had gone out of his performance, replaced by something that felt more like obligation than inspiration. His relationship with Victoria Principal crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny and Andy's increasing instability. The breakup, when it came, was messy and public, providing tabloid fodder while deepening Andy's sense of failure and inadequacy. "I don't think I'll see 40, he told a close friend during this period, a statement that seemed like melodrama at the time but would later take on the quality of prophecy. The cocaine use, which had begun as a party drug shared with other young celebrities, escalated into something much more serious. For Andy, drugs provided temporary escape from the crushing weight of being constantly observed, constantly judged, constantly expected to be perfect. But cocaine also amplified his natural anxiety and depression, creating a cycle of highs and crashes that made it increasingly difficult for him to function professionally. Concert promoters began canceling tours. Record executives expressed concern about his reliability. The industry that had created him began to distance itself from the mess he was becoming. Music versus medication. The natural high of artistic creation versus the artificial escape of chemical numbing. The 1980s brought new challenges as musical tastes shifted away from disco toward new wave and heavy metal. Andy found himself not just struggling with personal demons but also fighting for relevance in an industry that had moved on to newer sounds and younger faces. His attempts at comeback were valiant but ultimately futile. He tried different musical styles, worked with new producers, attempted to reinvent his image. But the combination of his addiction, his damaged reputation, and the industry's short attention span created obstacles that proved insurmountable. The phone calls that had once flooded his answering service dwindled to a trickle. In 1977, everyone wanted to work with Andy Gibb. By 1987, few people in the industry would take his calls at all. He had become famous to be destroyed, and destruction had become its own kind of performance. The industry taught Andy Gibb to sing. It never taught him to breathe. The final years were spent in relative obscurity, moving between England and America, staying with friends and family members who tried to provide the stability and support he had never found in fame. He talked about getting clean, about recording again, about finding a way back to the music that had once been his salvation. But the boy who had been made famous for his ability to love and be loved had lost the ability to love himself. The heart that had powered millions of teenage dreams had been worn down by years of abuse, neglect, and impossible expectations. His final recording sessions were painful to witness. The voice that had once effortlessly conveyed emotion now sounded strained and uncertain. The natural charisma that had made him a star seemed to flicker in and out like a faulty electrical connection. The move back to England in his final months represented both retreat and attempted reconciliation. With his family, with his past, with the person he had been before fame transformed him into someone else. But the damage was too extensive, the addiction too entrenched, the depression too deep. Two phones, two eras. 1977 brought endless opportunities. 1987 delivered only silence. On March 10, 1988, his heart simply stopped, not from a dramatic overdose or a spectacular collapse, but from the accumulated weight of too much feeling, too much pressure, too much fame at too young an age. Not an overdose, but an accrual. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Andy, the answer came too late and at too high a cost. By the time he recognized the need for escape, the time was too short, the damage too extensive, the support systems too absent. The stage lights that made him also burned him, but he never learned how to step out of their reach. When Andy Gibb died quietly on March 10, 1988, at the age of 30, the world noticed in a way it hadn't during his final struggling years. The obituaries focused on his achievements, the chart successes, the teen idol status, the connection to his famous brothers. But they missed the deeper tragedy, the waste of talent, the failure of an industry to protect its young stars, the cost of fame without emotional scaffolding. The immediate response to Andy's death revealed the complex relationship between celebrity and mortality in American culture. While his passing was widely reported, the coverage often felt more focused on the cautionary tale aspect of his story than on the actual loss of a human being. Headlines emphasized the tragic nature of his death while providing little context for the systemic failures that had contributed to his downfall. His funeral was attended by fewer than 50 people, family members and close friends gathering to mourn someone they had loved, while the media treated it as the final chapter in a cautionary tale. The boy who had once filled stadiums was buried in a ceremony that felt almost private, the way he had always wanted his life to be. The contrast between his public fame and private funeral served as a final illustration of the disconnection between Andy Gibb the brand and Andrew Roy Gibb the person. Barry Gibb's eulogy delivered to the small gathering of mourners avoided the cliches about dying too young and tragic waste of talent that had already begun to dominate media coverage. Instead, he spoke about the little brother who had taught them all that vulnerability could be a form of strength, that emotional openness was not weakness, and that the ability to make others feel loved was perhaps the greatest gift anyone could possess. The music industry's response was largely institutional rather than personal. Record executives issued statements expressing condolences while simultaneously calculating the commercial potential of posthumous releases. Radio stations played retrospective segments that focused more on his hits than on his humanity. The machinery that had created and consumed Andy Gibb continued to operate even after his death, treating his story as content to be packaged and sold rather than a tragedy to be learned from. But his death marked more than the end of a life. It represented the closing of an era when young performers could be manufactured quickly and discarded just as fast. Andy Gibb had been both the pinnacle and the victim of the teen idol system, proof that talent and charisma weren't enough to survive the machinery of fame without proper support systems, emotional guidance, and genuine human connection. The timing of his death, coming at the end of the 1980s, made it a symbolic conclusion to a decade that had been defined by excess and surface glamour. The Reagan era's emphasis on appearance over substance, wealth over wisdom, and image over authenticity had found its perfect victim in Andy Gibb. A young man whose greatest strength had been his emotional authenticity, and whose greatest vulnerability had been his need to be genuinely loved rather than simply adored. In the weeks following his death, radio stations around the world experienced an unexpected phenomenon: spontaneous tributes from listeners who called in to share personal stories about what Andy's music had meant to them. These calls revealed the depth of connection that his songs had created with ordinary people who had found in his vulnerability permission to acknowledge their own emotional needs and romantic longings. The music he left behind took on new meaning in the wake of his death. Songs that had once seemed like simple love ballads revealed themselves as complex, emotional documents. Chronicles of a young man struggling to understand his own feelings while performing happiness for millions of strangers. His influence on the artists who came after him was more profound than most realized. The idea that male performers could be vulnerable, emotionally complex, sensitive without shame, that they could express tenderness without sacrificing masculinity, challenged industry assumptions and cultural expectations. Andy Gibb had made vulnerability valuable in pop music. He had shown that male artists could wear their hearts on their sleeves, could sing about need and longing and emotional fragility without being dismissed as weak. In an era when masculine pop stars were expected to be either rebellious bad boys or untouchable cool guys, Andy offered a third option: the sensitive soul who wasn't afraid to admit he needed love. The Bee Gees gave us harmony. Andy gave us permission to break. His romance with Victoria Principal, which had been dissected endlessly by the tabloid press, was remembered by those close to both of them as a genuine love story complicated by impossible circumstances. Neither had been prepared for the level of scrutiny their relationship attracted, and both carried regret about how it ended. The relationship with his brothers, which had been complicated by competition and comparison during his lifetime, was revealed in death to have been deeper and more supportive than the media had portrayed. Their grief was genuine and lasting, their regret palpable in interviews they gave years later about the brother they couldn't save. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Andy's case, the hidden forces were systemic rather than conspiratorial, an industry that valued profit over people, a culture that worshipped youth without protecting it, a system that created stars without teaching them how to survive stardom. His story serves as both inspiration and warning for anyone who finds themselves thrust into the spotlight at a young age. It demonstrates that talent without support systems is dangerous, that fame without emotional maturity is destructive, and that the music industry's traditional approach to developing young artists was fundamentally flawed. The disco era that had made him famous was already fading by the time of his death, but his music transcended its original context. Songs like I Just Want to Be Your Everything and Shadow Dancing continued to find new audiences, their emotional honesty speaking to universal themes of love, loneliness, and the search for connection. The cultural impact of Andy Gibb's brief career extended far beyond chart positions and album sales. He had arrived at a moment when popular music was beginning to acknowledge that male vulnerability could be as compelling as traditional masculine stoicism. In an era dominated by disco's artifice and rock's aggression, Andy offered something different, genuine emotion delivered without irony or defensiveness. His influence can be traced through generations of male performers who followed, from George Michael's tortured romanticism to Justin Timberlake's sensitive bad boy persona, from the emotional openness of early Bee Gees-influenced bands to the confessional singer-songwriters of the 1990s. Andy had proven that audiences, particularly female audiences, were hungry for male stars who weren't afraid to appear needy, vulnerable, or emotionally available. The teen idol industrial complex that had created and destroyed Andy also began to evolve in response to his tragedy. While the fundamental dynamics remained unchanged, young performers being manufactured and marketed to adolescent audiences, his story became a cautionary tale that informed how some managers and record labels approached the development of young talent. Mental health resources in the entertainment industry, virtually non-existent during Andy's peak years, gradually became more available as his story and others like it highlighted the psychological costs of early fame. The idea that success could be traumatic, that celebrity could be a form of abuse, that talented young people needed protection from their own gifts. These concepts, radical in the 1970s, became accepted wisdom by the 1990s. His relationship with his brothers, examined through the lens of history, revealed the complex dynamics of family businesses where love and commerce become inextricably intertwined. The Bee Gees had to balance their genuine care for Andy with the practical realities of their own careers, their responsibilities to their families, and the limitations of their ability to save someone who couldn't save himself. The tragedy of Andy Gibb also illuminated the particularly American aspects of celebrity culture that distinguished it from other entertainment markets. While he had been successful in Australia without losing himself, the American star-making machinery had transformed him into something that bore little resemblance to the person he had been. The scale, intensity, and commercial focus of American fame had proven toxic to someone whose gifts were essentially intimate and personal. In the years following his death, Victoria Principal would speak rarely but movingly about their relationship, describing a young man whose public image captured only a fraction of his complexity. She painted a picture of someone who was funnier, more intelligent, and more deeply wounded than his teen idol persona suggested. A person who had been reduced to a commodity when he deserved to be understood as a complete human being. In the end, Andy Gibb's greatest achievement was not the records he sold or the charts he topped or the hearts he broke. It was the vulnerability he brought to popular music, the way he made it acceptable for male performers to express tenderness and uncertainty. The model he provided for emotional honesty in an industry that often rewarded artifice. He had learned to sell every emotion except the one he needed most. Self-compassion. And perhaps that is the most important lesson his story offers. That in a world that profits from our performances, the most revolutionary act is learning to love ourselves without an audience. Two mirrors, two men. Andy on stage, Andrew alone. In the end, they both needed the same thing. Not more applause, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're enough just as you are. So we're left with questions that echo beyond Andy Gibb's particular tragedy. Questions that speak to anyone navigating the treacherous waters between public success and private struggle. How do we protect sensitivity in a world that exploits it? Can fame and mental health coexist? What do we owe to the young artists we elevate to impossible heights? Andy Gibb found his answers too late, in the silence of an English countryside that couldn't heal what Hollywood had broken. He didn't choose to disappear, he simply ran out of light. But in that final darkness, perhaps he found the peace that had eluded him under all those blazing spotlights, the permission to finally stop performing and just be. The greatest performance is sometimes learning when to leave the stage.